Hello everybody and welcome to Chapter 11, the first chapter of Module 3, and that is our third and final module for the course. So we're going to look here at aggregate expenditures, which is the overall amount of spending in an economy. So we're going to look at, once again, assumptions and simplifications, what we consider both consumption and investment schedules, equilibrium GDP, and equilibrium GDP works very similar to equilibrium we've already seen. What happens when we look at international trade, government spending, and the difference between equilibrium and full employment GDP. So we're going to use this model, the aggregate expenditures model, and it was developed by a man named John Maynard Keynes, and he was an economist in the 1930s who decided to come up with a new model to greatly explain what we were seeing with the Great Depression, because the Great Depression acted very different than recessions we had seen previous. And he came up with this to try to explain how economies adjust to shocks. Now, this model has since been replaced to a degree, but a lot of his theories are still used. So we're going to start with the simplest model, where we ignore government and also trade. So we're looking at what's known as a private closed economy. No international trade, no government spending, and we're going to consider all savings to be personal, not business. So this is the simplest model, just to learn the theories. So in this case, with no government or foreign trade, GDP, national income, personal income, and disposable income all are the same. Now the reason he came up with this model was to try to explain why recessions were acting different than they should on paper, and that has to do with the fact that consumer prices, for the most part, are very sticky or don't rapidly change to shocks. So if we look here, here's our investment demand curve. So investment is irrespective of GDP, and that's something to keep in mind. What actually, remember, generates the demand for investment? Demand for investment is a function of interest rates. As interest rates go up, we have less investment. As they go down, we have more. The GDP of a country has really nothing to do with investment. So as you look here, investment is constant at all levels of GDP. In this case, 20 billion. So if we look here, we can look at different levels of the economy. So in certain cases, we have low employment, and we have smaller GDPs. When we hit the part that is highlighted at 65 million employment, GDP is equal to spending. So real domestic output, or GDP, is 470. Spending is 470 as well. So we have consumption and investment equaling domestic output, or GDP. Why isn't savings part of expenditures? Because anything saved is not spent. It has to be either consumed or invested. So that's why we're adding those two. And that's equilibrium. Equilibrium is where an economy wants to be. Just like products try to find equilibrium in their prices, the overall economy tries to find equilibrium as well, where we're operating at that notion of full employment, and everything being produced in the economy is being consumed. Now on paper, once again, is always better than in practice, but what equilibrium GDP means is instead of one product, all the goods and services in an economy are being consumed. We don't have unplanned inventories, negative or positive. If you have a shortage or unplanned changes in inventories or negative at the beginning levels, generally we're going to employ more people to make more things, and in the top levels, if you have a surplus, too much inventory, people are probably going to lose their jobs. Anything other than equilibrium is not sustainable long term. Long term is equilibrium GDP is where the economy wants to be. And if we look here, it works very similar to individual products, where it's the cross of your lines. So you have your spending line in blue, and then you have your consumption line, in this case, consumer spending and business investment, in black. And where they cross here, that's the equilibrium point. Why is C plus IG GDP? Because this was a closed economy. We were not taking into account government spending or taxes. We're going to add those back in a little bit. And and trade. So at equilibrium GDP, savings equals investment. Why? Because everything saved is used by banks for investment purposes. So savings is going to equal investment. Now, once again, this is a very simplified example. Saving is a leakage in spending, investment's an injection of it. So we consider them to be equal because in this case we're not taking into account taxes or the government or trade. And we would say there's no unplanned changes in inventories. Firms don't change production. They just simply vary production based on the economy. So if we look here, changes in the aggregate schedule and the multiplier effect. So remember, we have that notion of a multiplier. And our multiplier here is going to be equal to 4. And that 4 is exactly the one we were looking at previously. So in this case, an upward shift of the expenditure schedule from C plus IG0 to C plus IG1 will increase equilibrium GDP. A downward shift will lower it. And the extent is depending on the size of the multiplier. In this case, your multiplier was 4. So next up, we can add international trade. And international trade can either have a positive or a negative effect, remember, on GDP. So international trade is exports minus imports. If a country exports more than it imports, it's going to increase GDP. If it imports more than it exports, it's actually going to reduce it. So in this case, XN can be both negative or positive, and it'll be subject to the multiplier as well. So if we look here, we can have two cases, one where exports are positive and one where they're negative. And trade is usually, once again, independent of GDP as well. So at all of these levels of GDP, we can either have positive or negative trade. If we have negative trade, that 5 billion in loss is going to actually decrease GDP by 20 billion due to your multiplier. So your equilibrium is going from 470 to 450. That's a change of 20, or 5 times the multiplier of 4. If trade is positive, it's going to go from 470 to 490, or a change of 20 billion as well. So if you do have a multiplier, you would multiply the change in exports and by the multiplier, and that would be its effect on GDP. If we look here, not every country has a negative or positive trade balance. The United States generally has the largest negative trade balance, both by the fact we are a major importer and we have an extremely large economy. China has the largest positive trade balance, but it might not be as large as you would think because they also import a lot of things. However, they are a manufacturing country, so they export more than they import. So depending on the country, you could see both negative and positive balances of trade. There is no right or wrong answer. It just depends on what economy you are studying. As for international economic linkages, if the world is doing good, it's generally going to increase our exports. So if there's prosperity abroad, we'll probably export more. Other countries, if their economies are doing well, they're going to want foreign products. What about exchange rates? The cheaper your currency is relative to others makes you more attractive for trade. China does this. A lot of countries will artificially manipulate their money to make it worth less compared to other countries' money. And the reason they do it is it becomes cheaper. Think of the Canadian dollar as worth a lot less than the US dollar. If you buy something that costs $100 here and $100 there, you're really getting a 25% discount if you buy it in Canada, because their money is worth a lot less. 100 Canadian dollars is not 100 US dollars. So if your money is much stronger than another country, it makes it attractive to import from that country, because you're paying for their products with money that's more powerful than theirs. If your money's weaker than another country's, it makes it attractive for them to import from you because their money is stronger than yours. So in this case, exchange rates can have great changes on trade. If your money is weak, it makes you attractive as an exporter. If your money's strong, you're attractive as an importer. But a caution on things like this. If you manipulate your currency, other countries may retaliate and do the same. And if you use tariffs is any form of a tax on international products. Why don't they usually work? Because once again, other countries usually respond by putting a tariff on your products, and it just raises everybody's costs and lowers GDP for everybody. So anti-trade policies usually have the opposite effect and actually hurt GDP for everyone. Now, if we add in the public sector, and this is the logic behind why the government spends in recessions, if we add in the public sector, what do? Government spending is also subject to the multiplier. So if we look here, more government spending should inject money into the economy. As for taxes, taxes are subject to the multiplier as well, but the only portion of the tax subject to the multiplier is what would have been consumed, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So if we look at government spending, the previous one, our equilibrium GDP, was at 470. Now we have a different thing, because expenditures is not C plus IG. Expenditures is now C plus IG plus trade plus government spending. So our expenditures have changed, and our equilibrium now jumps to 550. At 550, government spending 20, balance of trade 0, investment 20, and consumption 510, so that would be 550, and our output would be 550 as well. So factoring in trade and the government actually raised our equilibrium GDP from where it was before. So if we look here, government spending change of $20 billion is going to have a large impact on the overall economy. Our multiplier is still 4, so a $20 billion change would be an $80 billion change in GDP, and that's what we're seeing here, going from 470 to 550. Now let's take into account taxes. Taxes are going to reduce disposable income. And what we're going to get here is less equilibrium GDP. So we were at 550. Now, what are our taxes going to do? Our taxes are going to reduce equilibrium GDP by the amount of taxes times the multiplier. So one thing to keep in mind here with taxes, they raise taxes $20 billion. That should lower GDP to the tune of 80, or back to our 470, but it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is not everything that is taxed would have been consumed. If our multiplier is 4, our marginal propensity to consume is 75%. So only 75% of those taxes would have been consumption. The rest would have been savings. So in that case, what you would have to do is multiply your 80 billion times 75%, and what you get is 60 billion. So your GDP is going to go down by 60 billion, or the part of the taxes that would have been consumed, 15 out of 20 billion, times the multiplier. So taxes will cause equilibrium GDP to back up. So a $15 billion decrease in consumption from a $20 billion increase in taxes. The reason being, not all of those taxes would have been consumed. You have to multiply that 20 billion by your MPC of 0.75, and then now you're multiplying 15 billion by your multiplier, not 20. So equilibrium GDP now $490 billion. And as we near the end of this chapter, what can happen is the following. So we can have both equilibrium and full employment GDP, and equilibrium GDP is not always full employment GDP. You can get what's known as a recessionary or inflationary expenditure gap. A recessionary expenditure gap exists when aggregate expenditures fall short of full employment GDP. And output falls and unemployment rises, and an inflationary one, aggregate expenditures exceed full employment GDP, and you get inflation. So the first one is not enough spending. We're spending below our full employment GDP, and what we have to do in a recession like that, increase government spending or cut taxes. We see that often in recessions. In inflation, we can either decrease government spending or increase taxes. We don't do that nearly as much. That's what we're dealing with right now. With the inflation we've been seeing, spending is usually exceeding full employment GDP, and remember, when there's too much spending, you get inflation. So these are two examples here. In graph A, we have a recessionary gap of $5 billion. We have a recessionary gap of $5 billion. Spending at AE1 is below where it should be at AE0, so we have a gap. Our real GDP, our equilibrium GDP, should be 510. It's really 490. In this case, it should be 510, and it's really 530. We have an inflationary gap here of too much spending, both of which are harmful long-term for the economy. So in the severe recession of 07 to 09, spending fell off a cliff. We see this in recessions, and that one was particularly bad. So consumption and investment both plummeted, and we had a recessionary gap as a consequence. We had unemployment at one point over 10%. So the federal government undertook Keynesian policies. They sent out rebate checks. They did a $750 billion stimulus package. And when did we see this again? We just saw this again during COVID. We just saw this again with all those rounds of COVID relief money, only it was trillions instead of billions this time. The same logic nonetheless. But it didn't work as well as it should have. And we'll get into why that is the case later on in the next few chapters. But if we look here on our last word, in classical economics, remember, Say's law is that supply creates its own demand. Remember that notion of the invisible hand, where the economy will self-correct and automatically adjust to various shocks, and that notion of laissez-faire, the government should stay out of the economy and let the markets determine everything. But Keynes in the 1930s was trying to understand why the Depression was this worldwide thing that seemed to go against classical economics, because markets weren't really self-correcting and the Depression persisted. So Keynes came up with the following. Cyclical unemployment can occur, causing these big gaps to GDP. The economy won't always correct itself. It can keep spiraling, that depression, due to things like prices that don't quickly adjust and all sorts of other stuff. And when we look at our previous chapter, where if one part of the economy does poorly, it can filter through the rest. And Keynes argued the government should actively manage macroeconomic instability. And that's something we're going to look at in the next few chapters as well. With that said, that takes us to the end of chapter 11.